episode 236. Welcome to Data Skeptic, a podcast about data science and fake news from an algorithmic perspective. Here's your host, Kyle Polich.
All right, Linda, our topic for today is the Louvain Method for community detection.
Louvain. How do you spell it?
Louvain. But focus more on the community detection part. What do you suppose that means?
Community detection.
Yeah.
Well, if you have a community, maybe you built a system, and then together they detect something.
Yeah, so community detection is all about finding out of a greater population what are the communities. For example, you must be a part of certain communities, right?
Yes, but I don't know what this detection means. Like an intruder?
Tell me about some of the communities you feel you're a part of. Like, are you a part of the LA tech community?
Sure, may not be that active, and maybe no one knows who I am. But
Doesn't matter, you're a part of it, right?
Yes, I'm a strong feminist. I'm also part of
the feminist community.
Lean in Los Angeles, which is...
What's that?
Well, Sheryl Sandberg wrote a book called Lean In.
Okay.
And then from there, they built a nationwide network of Lean In chapters across the U.S., and I'm part of the LA chapter.
Okay, cool. So that's a community you're in, right?
Yes.
What about other communities you're a part of? Any soccer leagues, any bake sales, anything like that?
We have our block club.
Yeah, we got the block club.
And then within the block club, I'm part of another neighborhood community called Third Thursdays, where we plan Third Thursday happy hours.
I'm a part of the skeptical community, but I don't know if you consider yourself part of that.
Well, we have our own community here with Yoshi.
Yeah, now you're starting to push the limits of what it means to be a community. You know, although, like, I don't want to underweight, minority communities, because that's part of the point of this too, right? A lot of communities are small. They're like, people who were part of a diaspora, and they're only like maybe 1% of Los Angeles, but they're a community, right? We have some famous small knit communities here in LA. Are you aware of any?
No.
What about like Little Ethiopia?
Or you're saying that's a community. Okay,
yeah.
Sure.
Or what about Little Saigon? Little Tokyo? LA likes the little in front of the...
Yeah, well, not very creative there. Isn't there a Little India or something?
I'm sure, yeah. There's sort of an intuitive idea of having a community, and we know that communities exist, right? That's not controversial. But if we have a lot of data about a population, how can we determine or find its communities sort of in a mathematical, precise, algorithmic kind of way? Can you see the need for such a process?
What does it mean for data to find its community? You mean like a number of twos want to be with other twos?
Sort of, yeah. So like, let's think about Twitter, right? Because that gets very digital very quickly. What is a person on Twitter? They're an account. They have people they follow and people who follow them. And within that, it establishes a graph. Every node is a person and every edge is a connection, and the bi-directional connections, like I follow you and you follow me, that seems to be stronger, right? Because that means we're like really connected. We're not just like fans of some other person. Mm-hmm. You could imagine where if you zoomed in on any community, let's talk about the ska community, right? You could find a ska band and notice that lots of people who follow that band also follow other bands and, different people within that organization. Or find and replace for something else. People who are part of like a bird watching community, they probably mutually follow each other.
Sure.
So there must be some mathematical process here, some structure to the underlying connections between people, which we could use to like isolate and extrapolate what are the communities and the sub-communities and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah. I'm on you. What's next?
Well, let's take a different approach for today's episode. Let's see if I can get you to engineer your own algorithm.
Good Lord.
Yeah. If you had all of this data, let's say you own Twitter, and you could do any queries you want against the database, and you wanted to find out what were the communities, how might you start by looking at it, given that you know about these follow types of linked data?
Twitter. Well, you could figure out who follows who, and then see if there's any overlap there, and there's probably clusters of communities where If you know one person and you know these three, then you're more likely to know these three other people. One example I noticed on Instagram, if you follow a certain number of people, they recommend these other people.
Yep, that's true. What do you suppose would happen with people that are just like generally well liked? Like, let's say, like someone like Tom Hanks.
That's an interesting example.
Yeah.
I don't know if he's well liked, but we could think of that. So what if someone's well liked?
Well,
what's
really,
your question,
like broadly liked, how would they fit into this scheme? It's not like, Tom Hanks was specifically embraced by like the Polish immigrant community. There's no like little sub community that's really into Tom Hanks. He's kind of like broadly, or Starbucks, It's not like people who grew up in Europe love Starbucks. Starbucks is sort of more universally appreciated.
So you're saying if someone is more universally liked, then what? What's your question?
Then it seems like even though they're popular, it's not really definitive of a community. A community is more about like a tight-knit group of people that all share some affinity.
Right. So that's why I brought up that word clusters. If you're a well-liked person, you probably don't have like clusters that are tight-knit.
So now let's talk about that cluster. What are some of the properties we expect a cluster that's useful to have?
Overlap. If you know this one person A, then you're more likely to know person B, C, and D.
So we would say that people within a community should be very likely to know each other, and they should also simultaneously not be likely to know people outside of the community, or at least not as often.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like of all those communities you mentioned that you're a part of, you certainly know people who don't fit into those communities.
Yes.
But how many connections do you have that are surprising, that are outside your communities versus inside?
Well, the surprising ones are far and fewer in between because I'm less likely to know them.
Well, like, do you know any actors or actresses?
Nope.
Despite living in Los Angeles, California?
I'm not in the entertainment community.
All right, well, do you know any editors?
I know people who cut commercials and stuff and promotional clips like that.
Yeah, at least 2 people I know are friends with you that are in that area.
Yeah.
You do know some people in that community, but you don't have the same ties that you do for like Lean in LA or LA Tech or things like that.
Sure.
If I were to look through all your connections
on LinkedIn
or in real life or whatever, you would have, well, actually that's kind of an interesting point. A lot of these online digital systems have now made it possible to do these sorts of studies at scale. People like LinkedIn can use the Louvain Method, whereas previously, the social scientists struggle with it a little bit. But it all comes down to this property that was defined called modularity. So modularity is a number between -1 and 1. And it's a measure of how, like the goodness of a community, or how much it seems to be a community. So start from the fact that we assume communities exist. Is that controversial?
No, communities exist.
They're out there. We just have to find a way to measure them. And that's what this is all about. So the main information you have in any graph, because of course a graph describes a network, is the number of incoming edges and the number of outgoing edges to any node. So this modularity is calculated in a particular way. I'll put the formula in the show notes. It's not super important we go over it here, but basically, you look at all the edge weights between 2 people, right? So you and I connect, that's an edge. And maybe our edge weight should be strong because we're married, we're in business together, all these kinds of things. You also have a strong edge weight like your sister and your parents, and maybe a medium edge weight to some of those people in our block club, and then a very loose edge weight to, I don't know, somebody who one time trimmed our trees or something like that, right?
So what's a loose edge weight? What's an edge weight?
An edge weight is just some numeric value that describes the strength of our connection.
Between 1 and 100?
Usually between 0 and 1, yeah, something like that.
So percentage.
Yeah, of how strong the weight is. It really depends. Like lots of different systems do this different ways, but you could probably normalize most things to 0 to 1, yeah.
Okay. So what did you ask me a question?
Right, well, sort of. I'm just kind of asking some leading questions. Let's talk about how a popular person works. Someone who's like a social butterfly. What do you think their connections look like?
Well, they probably have many.
Yeah, of course.
And the many ties are Probably very strong in both directions.
Sometimes, but
Well, if you're not a social butterfly, that means if people don't like you, then I don't think you're a social butterfly.
Well, but think about like a campaigning politician who's very charismatic. They might meet a lot of people, shake a lot of hands, but those are all kind of like weak connections.
Well, are they a social butterfly, or are they just well connected?
And charismatic and stuff, yeah. So there must be some strength to every connection, Like
yes.
the people I call on my phone, I'm more connected to than the people I follow on Twitter, right? Naturally.
The people you call, yeah, I mean, everyone who calls someone probably knows that person better.
We can assume there's some edge weight, some strength of the connection between two people. So let's go back to the fact that we assume there's a community, right? And we can now look at all the edge weights within the community and say like, well, of the people we think might be in a community together, how do their edge weights differ from the edges that they have extending outside the community? So even though like we're part of the Los Angeles tech community, yeah, we have a lot of strong connections in it, we're connected to people that have nothing to do with that. But we have more internal community connections than external. And that's probably true of the whole community, right? People in LA tech are all very connected. It's maybe even a little bit inbred, people could say. And all of those people connect outside of that group, but they connect more strongly inside than they do outside, if that makes sense.
Well, that is the definition of a community, right?
Well, that's what the Louvain Method would have us believe, yes.
Well, what do we define what a community is? Can you tell me, when you keep saying community, which I feel like is the number one word we've repeated, can you tell me what a community is?
A community is a subset of a social network or a social graph.
So you could just talk broadly. It could be a big segment or a small segment.
Yeah, either way, it could be. Like a big segment could be, the community of football fans.
Well, Los Angeles.
Well, sure, yeah, compared to the whole world, yeah.
Yeah, that's a big community.
And then you could break it down to like the LGBTQ horror fan community. That's a lot smaller.
So does the Louvain Method comment on a community?
It attempts to be a means of measuring and mostly detecting communities. We run small surveys every once in a while. Maybe some of you have participated in some of those. And recently, we were fishing for just general interests, like what kind of movies do people like? Of course, Ex Machina came up a lot. Under TV shows, I think Doctor Who was number one. And this got me thinking, I bet a lot of you would like to check out sci-fi, that's P-H-I, not phi, sci-fi, science fiction as philosophy. It's available on the Great Courses Plus. It's presented by Dr. David Kyle Johnson. So let me tell you what these 24 lectures have in store for you. You're going to get a deep philosophical exploration. First of the movie Inception. Second lectures on the Matrix. Of course, questions of free will become very interesting there. Star Trek The Next Generation. Ooh, Dark City, that was a good movie. There's a whole lecture on Westworld and artificial intelligence. Ooh, Blake 7, tremendous theme song. All the classics and the modern things are here and discussed. Those that have some interesting philosophical implications. Naturally, there's a whole lecture on the Prime Directive. If you like science fiction, but you want to know a little bit more about the broader implications that the authors and creators of this sort of content have intended, you really should check out Sci-Fi via the Great Courses Plus. If you're not interested in that one, the Great Courses Plus has thousands of fascinating lectures to enjoy. Math, robotics, logic, history. Watch or listen anytime from anywhere with the Great Courses Plus app. And now is the perfect time to start enjoying the Great Courses Plus. They're giving our listeners a free trial with unlimited access to the entire library. Sign up now through my special URL. It's thegreatcoursesplus.com/data. One more time, thegreatcoursesplus.com/data.
So what does it say? How do you detect communities?
So the Louvain Method uses a concept called modularity that I mentioned, between -1 and 1. And it's used to evaluate a potential community. So we divide people up, maybe randomly or through some process. There's obviously an algorithmic way to do this, but once you think you've got your community, then you have this delta function that just says, are these two people in the same community, yes or no, 1 or 0? And then once you have that, you can iterate over all the edges and measure the edge weight for people in the community versus outside the community. And there's a little formula, which won't convey very well in audio format, but people can look in the show notes for it, that defines this measure called Q. And a Q is the strength of the modularity of that community, how likely it is that this is a community.
So the Q is a number between 0 and 1.
-1 and 1.
Okay.
So you could imagine like left-handed people. We all have a common trait, right? You and I are both left-handed.
Yes.
Do you consider yourself part of the left-handed community?
Yes.
Really? How many left-handed?
We are small and mighty. You're part of my left-handed community. My sister, my parents are. And we have looked at Yoshi the bird.
Right.
And we have been trying to decide if she is left-footed or right-footed. And we can't tell.
And we are an oppressed group, are we not?
Impressed?
Oppressed.
Oppressed, yes. People don't understand until you're left-handed.
Yes, and it is a lifetime of minor inconveniences. And one of these days, when other social issues get sorted out, the left-handed people will have our day. We'll get, fair notebooks and good pens and stuff.
Notebooks. You know, they should just make a notebook that you could flip on the front and the back, and they look equal, and you could do upside down, and it's equal on both sides.
Yeah, I've bought those. They're really not worth the money, but you can get them.
Yeah, well, why do they make it so expensive? Like, come on, just produce all of them like that.
Well, we're an underserved minority community. Maybe some entrepreneur wants to pursue us.
Just don't care.
Right, but even though, we do sometimes point out that we're connected to a lot of left-handed people and whatnot, and it's kind of like a thing you notice about other people, it's not really like we have a strong affinity amongst other southpaws. We don't go to left-handed meetups.
We don't go to it, but if you did go, you would have a strong affinity.
Are you saying
that I personally, do I have a strong affinity? Or are you saying does the world have a strong affinity?
Does the world, I guess, because that's what
I think there's a left-handed meetup.
Is.
I think there is. So you can't comment on that.
Well, okay, so let's explore what would Louvain do with that. It's most likely it would not detect, or at least not weight this as a strong community, because I presume left-handed people share a lot of external connections, almost as many as internal. So even if you were like hardcore into this and you went to the left meetup and you had a Ned Flanders t-shirt and all that kind of stuff, it wouldn't be so strong that you only associate with left-handed people, right?
That's sadly impossible.
Versus like think of any community that are immigrants where they want to share their culture and their language. Sometimes they all live in one area. Those sorts of groups are very tight-knit. They intermarry, they interrelate, they work for each other, all these kinds of things. That's going to be a much stronger community by mathematical methods, by the Louvain Method for one, than left-handed people.
Okay.
One of the properties we'd like to see would be that, the Hasidic Jewish community is measured as a more strong community than the left-handed community, presumably, right?
So you're positing a theory, okay.
Well, I think that's pretty non-controversial. That's a stronger community than all the left-handed people.
Okay, so that's your theory. That's what you would expect. What do you do now?
Well, now we can verify. This is, it's not falsifiability, but it's a supporting reason why we would believe in something like the Louvain Method as a means of community detection, because we can say that mathematically its process would definitely highlight that some of those actual reasonable subcommunities would be more detected because those groups have more internal linking than external linking.
Mm-hmm. Is that what you find when you do use this method?
Yeah, I'm not a super expert in this. I've applied it a couple of times in my career, mostly on sort of fishing expeditions where we're just trying to do some basic stuff. But yes, it works surprisingly well on any large-scale amount of data. So if you try and do this with 1 million users or something like that, you might not get that much interesting results. But actually, 1 million is probably the tipping point. Right around there, you have enough data that you start to see these emergent properties. And if you calculated communities based on this process and you looked at them after the fact, even if you did some sort of double-blind test where you showed people the Louvain communities and random communities, it would be very clear that is a community. So I did this one time with one commercial project where we were doing some recommendation stuff, and we applied this to, and I'm being a little vague here, I know, but basically we looked at people's interests, what stuff they showed an interest in on a website, and it was very clear that the communities all liked things that were of certain categories. So had this been a music site, it would have been like, oh, this is the metal community and the rap community and the ska community and the punk community and the, reggaeton community and all that kind of stuff.
So why are you talking about this method today?
Well, it seemed to me it fit in our discussion of fake news because when you look at social networks, you expect there to be community properties. And the producers of fake news generally don't, or the people that perpetuate it sometimes, may not show strong community ties. If someone creates like a bot network, the bot network, it might all interconnect with each other, but they all do one action and they have depending on how you build it, if you build a bot network, it'll either be a super community where you link up all your bots together and, they're connected to only themselves and no one else. And then it's suspiciously strong in modularity. Or you create these random bots and they don't build any actual community connections. And then they are these like community-less entities. And that's another means of detecting fake accounts.
Okay, so you're suggesting that if fake news was your problem and you were Facebook, you would suggest they use the Louvain Method.
Yeah, one of the metrics you would want to be looking at is definitely these Louvain methods, the measurement of modularity. That would certainly help in identifying whether or not people seem legitimate, that they are involved with and engaged with certain communities, and whether or not certain communities are perpetuating information in certain ways. So it is not the solution to fake news by any stretch of the imagination, but a very surprisingly powerful metric for how simple it is arithmetically.
So do you think Facebook is already using it?
I mean, I don't have any insider information yet. I'm trying to get my foot in the door there. But it would be surprising to me if they were ignoring this, I'll put it that way.
I feel like they are using it because when I worked at a prior retail company, we created our own Facebook fake account, just a test account to test posts. And I was told we need to be friends with each other and our other coworkers' test accounts and our real account, because if Facebook detected that you weren't friends with anyone, they would remove you.
Yeah, I suppose that is an issue for certain QA engineers.
Yeah, definitely. I think they're using some kind of method.
What you're describing there might be more simplistic and rule-based, that you just, say an account has to meet certain criteria. But that is the root of this concept, yes, of measuring what communities exist inside of data. And if someone is suspiciously absent of all communities, well, that's either a person lacking in social skills or maybe a fake account. Either way, Louvain Method could be a good means of detecting them, or studying communities at a more broad sort of social sciences kind of way. I don't delve into that stuff so much myself, but I do believe that this is an algorithm that is commonly a starting point for a lot of people trying to do some sort of network analysis or study of diasporas or community stuff in general.
Like LinkedIn.
Yeah, LinkedIn, I'd love to have a guest from LinkedIn on soon one day to talk about how they apply techniques like this. We'll have to look and see make that possible.
Well, I'll be sure to tune in.
Let's assume that the Louvain method does what you need. It does community detection for you. I'm not going to say it's perfect, but it works pretty good for a lot of reasons. And if you go into the literature, you'll find that it's both computationally efficient and comparative in terms of performance with other fancier algorithms. So overall, something that can't be ignored. Let's say we apply it. Do you think that people who share news within a community versus external to a community, which area is likely to spread fake news more?
If someone shares a post within versus outside their community?
Yeah.
Oh, outside your community.
Why do you say that?
It's going to spread more because your community is limited. If you only know 5 people, it doesn't go very far.
But what if that community is intense about sharing the same sorts of ideas in an echo chamber?
But if it's an echo chamber, it still is sectioned off to just that one corner.
Yeah, perhaps. But I mean, not every community is small. Like maybe there are people who just dislike a particular political candidate, and no matter what, they share anything that's negative to them. That seems like a mechanism for producing more fake news or perpetuating it, right?
What do you think?
Well, I think this is a more complicated question than we can answer here. I was just hoping you might speculate. Based on some of the information we got from former guest Gordon Pennycook, who taught us that people actually recognize fake news better when it relates to their actual political alignment, I would suspect that, and I'm obviously stretching his result a little bit out of proportion, but I think that probably scales up and generalizes that within a community, news that's actually relevant to that community probably has a good vetting process. Like, let's say there's some tennis community, people who know tennis really well would quickly be like, no, that can't be right. That's not real. But if there's some like fake medicine thing where people say like, oh, use acupuncture, which doesn't work at all, to help your tennis, because tennis people aren't an expert in medicine, maybe that bad information would circulate within the group. But if they said like, oh, Serena Williams is provably the best player ever, maybe she is, maybe she isn't, but the people inside that community wouldn't spread that news as quickly, uncritically, because they know enough about it. So I think within communities, the spread of fake news would be slower because there's some expertise, some gestalt sort of knowledge, some wisdom of the crowd. But when information requires external information or crosses these community boundaries, it seems to me that there's a bigger risk that fake information would get perpetuated. But that's just a hypothesis.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear what Facebook has to say.
Yeah, hopefully they'll come on the show and talk to us. I'm working on it.
Yeah, I mean, they have the biggest amount of data. What are they finding in their community? And how does fake news spread? I'm sure they could track it.
Well, they certainly have some ideas, and hopefully we'll get into that in the near future. So thanks as always for joining me, Linda.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Data Skeptic, where the news may be fake, but the data doesn't lie. Support the show and find extended materials at dataskeptic.com.